The glow of the high-definition monitors painted Junho's face in a spectral, electric blue, casting long, sharp shadows across the expanse of his private office. He sat in the dark, the leather of his chair creaking softly as he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with the precision of a predator tracking a disturbance in the brush. To the outside world, Junho was a legitimate businessman, a handsome, 31-year-old titan of industry with a jawline that could cut glass and a tailored suit that cost more than most people earned in a year. But within the fortified walls of this estate, he was the head of a syndicate that demanded absolute loyalty and punished deceit with ruthless efficiency. For weeks, he had felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere of his home, a disruption in the meticulously ordered ecosystem he controlled. Supplies were vanishing. Not money, nor the jewels locked in the safe, but small, insignificant things. Loaves of bread, cartons of milk, portions of meat from the kitchen. It was an insult not to his wallet, but to his authority. He had installed the new, microscopic cameras not to catch an assassin, but to catch a thief, a rat gnawing at the edges of his empire. His finger hovered over the control panel as he isolated the feed from the kitchen, the timestamp reading 2 a.m. The house was silent, a sprawling mausoleum of marble and shadow, but on the screen, there was movement. It was the new maid, Camille. She moved with a practiced, terrified grace, her dark blue uniform blending into the dimness of the service hallway, the white apron a stark contrast like a beacon in the night. She was a striking woman, 30 years old with a resilience etched into her features, but right now, her posture was hunched, her head on a swivel as she checked the empty corridors. Junho watched, his jaw tightening, as she opened the pantry. She didn't take the silverware. She didn't look for the safe. Instead, her trembling hands reached for a discarded heels of bread and a thermos of water. Junho felt a surge of cold disappointment. He had hired her because she seemed different, quiet, hardworking, desperate enough to be loyal, but she was just another parasite. He watched her wrap the food in a napkin, looking over her shoulder one last time before slipping out the back service door toward the overgrown, neglected garden annex where the old storage units were kept. He switched camera views, his fingers dancing across the keyboard to follow her path. He expected her to sit on a bench and eat, to gorge herself on what she had stolen. He was ready to call security, to have her thrown out into the rain. But as the camera in the courtyard zoomed in, the narrative he had constructed began to fracture. She wasn't eating. She was running, breathless and frantic, toward the one building Junho had been told was structurally unsound, the building where his aunt, Madame Choi, had insisted no one ever go. The rain lashed against the windows of the manor, a relentless drumming that mirrored the turmoil in Camille's chest as she stood before the heavy oak door of the annex a few weeks prior to the discovery. She had come to this job with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate need to survive in a city that chewed people up and spat them out. The agency had warned her that the master of the house was dangerous, a man of few words and terrifying reach, but the salary was enough to pull her out of debt, enough to restart a life that had stalled. When she first arrived, the mansion felt less like a home and more like a fortress. The ceilings were impossibly high, swallowing the sound of footsteps, and the air was perpetually chilled, smelling of expensive cologne and lemon polish. She had been given the dark blue dress and the crisp white apron, a uniform that stripped away her individuality and turned her into part of the furniture. You see nothing, you hear nothing, you say nothing, Madame Choi, the head housekeeper, had hissed on her first day. Choi was a woman of severe angles and a smile that never reached her eyes, ruling the staff with a tyranny that bordered on sadistic. She had given Camille a tour of the boundaries, pointing a manicured, talon-like finger toward the West Wing annex. That area is condemned. Rotting floorboards. If you go there, you will be fired. Or worse. Camille had nodded, keeping her eyes on the floor, absorbing the threat. For the first month, she had been a ghost, scrubbing floors until her knuckles were raw, dusting vases that cost more than her childhood home. She saw Junho only in passing, a dark silhouette at the top of the stairs, a blur of motion entering a black limousine. He was terrifyingly handsome, but his eyes were voids, empty of warmth, scanning the world for threats. He seemed less like a man and more like a weapon kept in a velvet case. But it was the silence of the house that unsettled her most. It wasn't the peaceful silence. It was the silence of secrets held under pressure. One evening, while polishing the silver in the dining room late at night, she heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the wind. It was a low, rhythmic thudding, followed by a faint, strangled cry coming from the direction of the garden, from the very annex Madame Choi had declared forbidden. Most of the other staff were too afraid to notice, or perhaps they were paid not to. But Camille had known suffering. She knew the sound of a human voice stripped of hope. It gnawed at her, a moral itch she couldn't scratch. She began to observe the flow of the house more closely, noticing the trays of food Madame Choi prepared personally, meager, watery gruel that looked unfit for a dog, and how the older woman would disappear into the rain with a set of keys she kept on a chain around her neck. The pivotal moment came on the night of the autumn banquet, an evening of grotesque excess that would eventually lead Camille to the act of theft Junho watched on his screens. The dining hall was ablaze with crystal chandeliers, the table groaning under the weight of roasted meats, exotic fruits, and bottles of wine older than the guests drinking them. Junho sat at the head of the table, a king surrounded by sycophants and soldiers, his face unreadable as he discussed territories and profits. Camille moved around the perimeter, refilling glasses, invisible in her servitude. She watched the food, trays of untouched galbi, mounds of rice, glistening pastries, being cleared away. The waste was staggering. In the kitchen, she watched the sous chefs scrape perfectly good food into the bin, joking about the gluttony of their bosses. The contrast made her stomach turn. While the powerful feasted, the memory of that cry in the garden haunted her. She waited until the kitchen staff had gone for their smoke breaks, until the house settled into its heavy, intoxicated slumber. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wasn't a thief. She had never taken a penny that wasn't hers. But the moral calculus of the situation had shifted. She moved to the pantry, her hands shaking as she grabbed 2 soft rolls and a piece of cooked chicken breast that had been destined for the trash. She wrapped them quickly in a cloth napkin, checking the hallway for the security guards who patrolled the perimeter. She didn't know about the hidden cameras. She only knew about the visible ones, which she carefully avoided by sticking to the blind spots the other maids gossiped about. This wasn't stealing for greed. It was a redistribution of survival. She slipped out the back door, the cold night air biting at her exposed skin. The garden was overgrown, the shadows stretching long and twisted like grasping fingers. She approached the annex, the condemned building. The windows were boarded up, but a faint light seeped through a crack in the wood. She crept closer, pressing her ear to the damp, rotting wood of the door. The sound came again, a whimper, weak and dry, the sound of a life fading. It was the sound of a mother. Madame Choi had told everyone the master's mother was in a luxury facility in Switzerland, living out her days in comfort. But the sound behind that door was not luxury. It was hell. Camille looked at the food in her hands, then at the rusty padlock. She knew how to pick a lock. It was a skill learned from a childhood where losing your house key meant sleeping on the street. With a hairpin and a trembling breath, she clicked the mechanism open. The smell hit her first, a stench of mildew, stale air, and unwashed humanity. It was a smell Camille recognized from the shelters she had volunteered in, the scent of neglect. She pushed the heavy door open just enough to squeeze through, closing it softly behind her to block out the wind. The room was essentially a cell. There was no furniture, only a thin, soiled mattress on the floor in the corner. Huddled on top of it was a figure so small, so frail, she looked like a pile of discarded rags. It was an elderly Korean woman, her hair matted and gray, her cheekbones protruding sharply against papery skin. This was Mrs. Park, the woman who had given birth to the most feared man in the city. She looked up as Camille entered, her eyes wide with terror, flinching as if she expected a blow. "Please," the old woman rasped in broken English, her voice barely a whisper. "No more water. Too cold, Camille's heart broke into 1,000 pieces. She rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside the mattress, ignoring the filth. "No, no," Camille whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. She unwrapped the napkin, revealing the bread and the chicken. "I'm not her. I'm not Choi. I brought food. Look. Real food." The transformation was immediate and heartbreaking. The old woman stared at the bread as if it were a diamond. She reached out with shaking, skeletal hands, snatching the roll and bringing it to her mouth with a desperation that made Camille look away in shame. Camille poured water from the small thermos she had brought, holding the cup to the woman's cracked lips. Slowly, Camille murmured, her hand resting gently on the woman's bony shoulder, offering a human touch that seemed to shock Mrs. Park more than the food. "You have to eat slowly for a moment." In that dark, forgotten room, the barriers of language, class, and race dissolved. There was only the primal connection of one woman caring for another. Mrs. Park wept as she ate, clutching Camille's arm as if she were an anchor in a storm. "My son," the old woman choked out between bites. "Does he know? Does Junho know?" Camille didn't know how to answer. She assumed the monster in the big house knew everything. She assumed this was his doing. But looking at the woman's eyes, seeing the confused love there, she hesitated. "Eat," Camille said softly. "Just eat now." Back in the surveillance room, the silence was deafening. Junho sat frozen, his hand covering his mouth, his breath hitched in his throat. The high-definition screen showed everything with merciless clarity. He had switched to the camera he had installed in the annex years ago, a camera Madame Choi had told him was broken, a feed she said was dead. He had fixed the connection remotely only minutes ago, expecting to catch Camille smoking or meeting a lover. Instead, he was staring into the abyss of his own ignorance. He watched the thief, the maid he had been ready to destroy, gently wiping crumbs from his mother's face. He watched his mother, the woman Madame Choi told him was senile, violent, and refusing to see him, clinging to this stranger's hand and weeping his name. The bread Camille had stolen was gone, consumed with a hunger that spoke of weeks of starvation. Junho felt a physical blow to his chest, a wave of nausea and rage so potent it made his vision blur. He had been told his mother was safe. He had been told she needed isolation for her mental health. He had trusted his aunt, the woman who had raised him after his father died, the woman who claimed to protect the family honor. He looked at the screen again. He saw the kindness in Camille's eyes, the way she stroked his mother's hair, the way she whispered comfort in the darkness. He looked at the stolen goods, a piece of bread he would have thrown away. He had constructed a world of enemies and allies, but he had been blind. The person stealing from him wasn't the maid taking the bread, it was the woman stealing his mother's life while living under his roof. He stood up, the chair crashing backward, his fists clenched so tight the knuckles turned white. The predator in him had woken up, but for the first time in years, it had the right target. He didn't reach for the intercom to call security. He reached for the drawer where he kept his personal gun, his eyes never leaving the image of the maid saving the woman he loved most. The revelation reshaped the air in the room, turning the oxygen into fire. He wasn't just a boss anymore. He was a son who had been lied to, and the reckoning was going to be biblical. The hallway leading from the surveillance room to the back exit was a corridor of suffocating silence, the kind of quiet that predates a violent storm. Junho moved through it like a specter, his footsteps heavy and deliberate on the plush carpet that had, until this moment, symbolized his absolute control over his domain. Every portrait of his ancestors lining the walls seemed to stare down at him with accusing eyes, their painted expressions shifting from pride to mockery in the flickering light of the sconces. He felt a phantom weight in his hand, the cold steel of the pistol he had tucked into his waistband, but the heavier weight was the crushing pressure in his chest. He had prided himself on knowing everything, on being the omniscient eye that saw every transaction, every betrayal, every fluctuation in the market. Yet, the greatest rod in his empire had been festering under the floorboards of his own home, orchestrated by the woman he had called aunt since he was a boy. He passed the kitchen, pristine and gleaming with stainless steel, a mockery of the starvation happening just 100 yards away. The contrast made bile rise in his throat. He thought of the lavish dinners, the discarded leftovers, the wine poured down the drain, while his mother, the woman who had sung him to sleep, who had sacrificed her own comfort to build this legacy, gnawed on stale bread in the dark. The realization wasn't just painful, it was a fundamental dismantling of his reality. He pushed open the heavy rear door, and the storm outside welcomed him, the rain lashing against his face, cold and shocking, washing away the carefully constructed veneer of the untouchable CEO. He didn't run. He walked with a terrifying, lethal purpose toward the annex, the mud splattering his Italian leather shoes, the wind tearing at his suit, indifferent to the elements because the fire inside him was burning hot enough to consume the world. Inside the annex, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and ancient dust, a sharp contrast to the sterile luxury of the main house. Camille was still on her knees beside the mattress, her hand trembling as she held the cup of water to Mrs. Park's lips. The old woman drank greedily but with difficulty, her throat unused to the mercy of hydration. Camille's heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She knew she had lingered too long. Every second she spent here was a gamble with her life, but looking at the frail creature before her, leaving felt like a greater sin than staying. Mrs. Park had stopped weeping, her eyes fixed on Camille's face with a mixture of awe and confusion, as if she were trying to memorize the features of an angel before waking from a dream. "You go now," Mrs. Park whispered, her voice a dry rasp that sounded like leaves dragging over pavement.
"Choi."
"She comes back. She hurts you." Camille shook her head, though fear was icing her veins. "I'm not leaving you like this," she whispered back, the defiance in her voice surprising even herself. "I don't care what she does.
"This isn't right."
"It's not right." Suddenly, the heavy wooden door behind them groaned. It wasn't the wind. The rusty hinges screamed in protest as the door was shoved open with a force that shook the rotting frame. Camille spun around, instinctively shielding the old woman with her body, her eyes wide with terror. She expected Madame Choi and her cane. She expected security guards with batons. Instead, a silhouette stood in the doorway, backlit by the storm, water dripping from broad shoulders. Lightning flashed, illuminating the face of the devil himself.
"Junho."
Camille stopped breathing. The bread wrapper crinkled in her clenched fist, the evidence of her crime. She braced herself for the shouting, for the violence, for the accusation of theft that would end her life. But Junho didn't look at her. His eyes, usually cold and impenetrable obsidian, were wide, shattered, fixed on the heap of rags behind her. He took a step forward, and the floorboards whined under his weight. He looked less like a mafia boss and more like a man walking to his own execution. He slowly raised his hands, palms open, showing he held no weapon, though the gun was hidden at his waist. He fell to his knees, not in prayer, but in collapse, the expensive fabric of his trousers soaking up the filth of the floor. "Mother?" The word came out broken, a fractured sound that didn't belong to the man who commanded legions. Mrs. Park gasped, her skeletal hand clutching Camille's arm so tightly her fingernails dug in. She squinted through the gloom, her mind clouded by years of isolation and lies. "Junho," she quavered, her voice trembling with a hope that was painful to witness. They said you were dead."
Choi said.
"You died." The lie hung in the air, a poisonous vapor. Junho let out a sound that was half sob, half growl. He crawled the remaining distance, ignoring the grime, ignoring Camille, until he was at the foot of the mattress. He reached out, his hands hovering over his mother's face, afraid that if he touched her, she might crumble to dust. "I'm here," he choked out, tears mixing with the rain on his face.
"I'm alive."
"I didn't know. Yama, I swear on my life, I didn't know." Camille watched, stunned into silence, as the power dynamic of the room inverted completely. The monster was weeping. The victim was comforting him. Mrs. Park reached out and touched her son's wet cheek, her thumb brushing away a tear. "My baby," she whispered, the maternal instinct surviving despite the starvation, despite the cruelty. "You are so big now. So handsome." Junho buried his face in her thin shoulder, his body shaking with racking sobs, the release of a grief he hadn't known he was carrying. Camille slowly backed away, feeling like an intruder on a sacred, tragic moment, yet she couldn't look away. She saw the rage building in Junho's shoulders as he pulled back, his eyes scanning his mother's condition, the bruises on her arms, the protruding ribs, the filth she was forced to sleep in. He turned his head slowly, locking eyes with Camille. For a second, she thought the rage was directed at her, and she flinched. But his expression softened, a flicker of profound, desperate gratitude breaking through the storm in his eyes. "Did you?" he started, his voice rough. "Did you bring the food?" Camille nodded, mute. Junho looked at the bread wrapper, then back at her. "Thank you," he said, the words heavy with obligation. "You didn't steal from me. You saved me." He stood up then, the movement fluid and dangerous, the grief hardening instantly into a cold, terrifying resolve. He stripped off his soaked suit jacket and wrapped it gently around his mother's shoulders. "We are leaving this place," he announced, his voice regaining the steel of command. "And then I am going to burn it down." The procession from the annex to the main house was a surreal nightmare. Junho carried his mother in his arms as if she weighed nothing, shielding her from the rain with his own body, while Camille followed close behind, carrying the thermos and the flashlight. They entered through the service entrance, bypassing the cameras Junho now knew were monitored by compromised eyes. He didn't take her to a guest room. He took her directly to the master suite, the most secure room in the mansion, a place no one but him was allowed to enter. He laid her gently on the sprawling bed with its silk sheets, the contrast between her rags and the luxury heartbreaking. He turned to Camille. "Stay with her," he ordered, not unkindly, but with an intensity that brooked no argument. "Lock the door from the inside. Do not open it for anyone but me. Not for the guards. Not for the housekeeper. Especially not for her." Camille nodded, understanding the gravity. She watched him check the pistol at his waist, his face setting into a mask of stone. He walked to the bedside phone and dialed a number. "Dr. Ree," he said, his voice flat. "Get to the estate.
Now.
Bring a trauma kit and nutritional IVs. No questions. And bring your personal security team." He hung up and turned to the door. "Where are you going?" Camille asked, her voice small. Junho paused, his hand on the doorknob. The look he gave her was void of humanity, a glimpse into the abyss of a man who had nothing left to lose but vengeance. "I have to go to breakfast," he said simply. "Madame Choi hates to be kept waiting." The sun was beginning to bleed through the heavy curtains of the dining room, casting long, red streaks across the mahogany table. Junho sat at the head, freshly changed into a pristine black suit, his hair slicked back, every inch the composed patriarch. The table was set for two. Silver cloches covered plates of steaming food, eggs, bacon, grilled fish, the smell of gluttony filling the air. He sat in silence, his hands folded on the table, watching the dust motes dance in the light. The door swung open, and Madame Choi bustled in, smelling of lavender and cruelty. She was an elegant woman in her 60s, wearing a tweed suit that screamed respectability, her hair coiffed into a severe bun. She smiled when she saw him, a tight, practiced expression that failed to hide the calculation in her eyes. "Junho," she chirped, taking the seat to his right. "You're up early. The staff said there was a disturbance in the kitchen last night. Did you catch the rat?" She unfolded her napkin with a flourish, completely at ease. She had played this game for years, convinced she was the grandmaster, convinced Junho was just a pawn who signed the checks. Junho didn't blink. He poured tea into her cup, the liquid dark and steaming. "There was a rat," he said smoothly, his voice devoid of inflection. "A very large, very old rat. It's been eating away at the foundation for a long time." Madame Choi chuckled, picking up her fork. "Well, I hope you fire them. We can't have thieves in the house. It sets a bad example." She lifted the cloche on her plate, revealing a perfectly poached egg. "By the way, the agency sent a profile for a new maid." The current one, Camille. She's a bit skittish, don't you think? I saw her wandering near the West Wing. I think it's time to let her go. Junho watched her cut into the egg, the yellow yolk spilling out. The West Wing, he repeated thoughtfully. You mean the annex? Where you told me the floor was rotting. Choi didn't look up, focused on her meal. Yes, dangerous. I keep it locked for everyone's safety. Junho reached for the remote control sitting on the table beside him. It's funny, he said, the temperature in the room dropping 10 degrees. I had the structural engineer's report from 10 years ago pulled up this morning. The foundation is solid concrete. Choi paused, the fork hovering halfway to her mouth. She looked at him, a flicker of unease twitching beneath her left eye. Paperwork is often wrong, Junho. You know how contractors are. Junho pressed a button. The large television screen mounted on the wall flickered to life. It didn't show the news. It showed the recording from last night. The timestamp. The dark room. Camille entering. And then the camera zooming in on the face of the woman on the mattress. The sound of the fork clattering onto the fine china echoed like a gunshot. Madame Choi stared at the screen, her face draining of color until she looked like a wax figure. On the screen, the dangerous prisoner was weeping over a piece of bread. Choi stood up, her chair screeching backward.
This
is a fake, she stammered, her voice pitching up into hysteria. Deep fakes. Someone is trying to trick you. Junho remained seated, watching her unravel with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen. Sit down, he said. The command was soft, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. Choi froze. She was sick, she screamed, abandoning the denial for justification. She was insane. She tried to hurt you when you were a baby. I protected you. I raised you when she couldn't. I built this family. Junho stood up slowly. You didn't build a family, he said, walking toward her until he was inches away, towering over her trembling form. You built a cage. You told her I was dead. You told me she was in Europe. You tortured her for 15 years, fed her garbage, and let her rot in her own filth while you wore her jewelry and spent her money. He reached out and ripped the pearl necklace from her neck, pearls that had belonged to his mother. The string broke, the pearls cascading onto the floor with a sound like falling rain. I'm not going to kill you, Aunt, Junho whispered, his voice terrifyingly calm. Death is too quick. You like the annex so much? You like isolation. He signaled to the door. 2 large security guards entered, men who were loyal only to the paychecks Junho signed. Escort Madame Choi to the basement storage, Junho ordered. The one without windows. She stays there until I decide otherwise. As they dragged her away, screaming and cursing, Junho looked back at the screen, at the image of Camille holding his mother's hand. The debt he owed the maid was immeasurable. 3 weeks later, the estate was unrecognizable. The silence that had once suffocated the halls was replaced by the low hum of renovation. The annex had been demolished, the wood burned in a bonfire that Junho had lit himself, watching the symbol of his ignorance turn to ash. In the main garden, the overgrown weeds were gone, replaced by rows of winter flowers. The sun was out, crisp and cold, shining on the glass table on the terrace. Mrs. Park sat in a wheelchair, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, her face still thin but her eyes bright and alert. She was watching the birds, a small smile playing on her lips. Camille sat across from her, not in a maid's uniform, but in a simple, elegant blouse and trousers. She was peeling a pear, slicing it into thin, manageable pieces for the older woman. The dynamic had shifted. She was no longer a servant, but a companion, a guardian whose loyalty had been forged in fire. She laughed at something Mrs. Park said, a genuine, warm sound that carried on the breeze. Junho watched them from the balcony of his office, a mug of coffee in his hand. The darkness that had shrouded him for years had lifted, leaving behind a man who was still dangerous, still powerful, but no longer blind. He had fired half the staff, the complicit ones, the ones who had looked the other way. He had rebuilt his inner circle with Camille's judgment as a compass. He walked down the stone steps, approaching the 2 women. Mrs. Park looked up, her face lighting up with recognition, a gift Junho never thought he would receive again. "Junho," she said, her voice stronger now.
Come sit.
Camille tells funny story. Junho pulled out a chair, sitting not at the head of the table, but between them. He looked at Camille. The fear that used to define her gaze when she looked at him was gone, replaced by a quiet, mutual respect. They shared a secret, a trauma, and a victory. "Thank you," he said again, as he did every day. Camille smiled, shaking her head. "She's beating me at cards, Junho. You need to watch out." Junho chuckled, a sound that felt foreign in his throat but right. He reached out and took his mother's hand, feeling the warmth of her skin, the pulse of life that had been stolen and returned. The surveillance cameras were still there, turning in the corners of the eaves, but they were no longer tools of paranoia. They were guardians. The master of the house had learned that true power wasn't in hoarding bread or instilling fear. It was in the courage to open the forbidden door and face the truth inside. And for the first time in his life, as he sat in the winter sun with the two women who had saved him, Junho felt not like a boss, but like a man who was finally home.